recording for the Q&A. Okay, great. Thanks, Noam. Please go ahead. You're on mute.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm fixed that. Thank you very much, Marina, for this very kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this wonderful curriculum. And good morning, everyone from Sydney. I would like to start my talk with acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where my home sits in what's called Sydney, and to acknowledge that their sovereignty has never been ceded, and to pay my respect to their elderly, past, present, and emerging, and to extend my acknowledgement, my respect to any Indigenous person who is joining us today or might be watching the recording later. And I hope that all of you are well and safe wherever you are in this crazy time of COVID. But nonetheless, this crazy time of COVID enabled me to zoom in from Sydney this evening, my time, and to join all of you and to celebrate this wonderful curriculum and a fantastic special issue about the rights of children to quality and early education development in South Africa, of the South African Journal of Human Rights. As was said by all the previous speakers, it is such a pressing issue, and it's great to see such a leading human rights journal dedicating an issue to children and to their rights and centering the discussion around early childhood development, an area which has vital importance to children and to their families. And in my talk today, I would like to talk about the right to development of children, mainly focusing on how the 1989 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child constructs child development and the care for child development as a matter of human rights, and to focus on one group of children to whom this special issue is dedicated, namely babies and toddlers. And obviously, I'm looking forward to the Q&A session afterwards, I think. And unfortunately, I won't be able to join your intimate groups later on, but I had a chance to read some of the drafts of your papers, and it's going to be an important contribution to the field. And I'm really looking forward to see how the final versions will look like. But back to international law, and the focus of my talk today will be mainly about international law and about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, where we can see a commitment to care for child development, which is embedded in the convention. It has been a key objective of international child rights law from day one. So going back to Article 1 of the 1924 the Geneva Declaration on the Right of the Child, which was one of the very few human rights documents adopted by the League of Nations, established after the First World War. So we look at Article 1 and we see that it provides a clear indication on the significance of child development under international human rights law. And I'm quoting, Principle 1 suggests the child must be given the means requisite for its normal development, both materially and spiritually. End of quote. And here, this is a clear indication of where we are heading. We see child development qualified as the objective of this convention, and we have two components of what child development is. It's about material development and spiritual development too, and we have a description about how development should occur in a normal way. Fast forward to 1959, when the UN adopted another declaration on the rights of the child. This declaration reaffirms the centrality of child development into international child rights law. And out of its 10 principles, 4 principles explicitly refer to child development as an objective, cementing it as a key concern for international child rights law. So I will quickly read through those 4 principles. Principle 2 that speaks about the child's rights to enjoy protection. And I'm quoting, the child should be given opportunities and facilities by law and by other means to enable him to develop physically, mentally, morally, spiritually, and societally in a healthy and normal manner, and in condition of freedom and dignity. So 5 dimensions of child development are mentioned there, and 2 qualifications for the process of development. It can be a healthy and a normal course of development. And this declaration continues in principle 4 to suggest that the child should enjoy the benefit of social security, and the child should be entitled to grow and develop in health. Cementing development even further. Principle 6 continues to suggest that the child, for the full and harmonious development of his personality, needs love and understanding. And there it should be possible, whenever it's possible, he should grow up in the care of under the responsibility of his parents, and in any case, in an atmosphere of affection and of moral and material security. Article 9 speaks about the child's right to be protected from abuse and neglect and from child labor. suggesting the child should not be admitted to employment before the appropriate minimum age, initially in no case be caused or permitted to engage in any occupation or employment which would prejudice his health or education or interfere with his physical, mental, or moral development. So we can see that this declaration qualifies the process of development, whether it's normal or healthy, and speaks about some specific dimensions of child development with respect to some core events in child's life, namely education, work, and the child's family and the ways in which are being brought up. And against this background, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has created a much more complex web of protection for child development. And first and foremost, we have the right to development cemented in Article 6 of the Convention that tells us that states parties should ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of the child. And in addition to this unique right to development under Article 6, one that you cannot find in any of the other binding UN human rights treaties, we have 5 additional articles that address 8 specific domains of child development, thus expanding the scope of protection and expanding the meaning of child development beyond what we had so far in 1959 or the 1924 Declaration. So the Convention, 5 articles. We have Article 29 that speaks about the aim of education, Article 32 that speaks about protection from economic exploitation, both mentioning child development as their objective. Article 23 that provides for the right of children with disabilities, coining development of this, the ability of children with disabilities to develop as one of its objectives. Article 27 that protects the right to an adequate standard of living, but an adequate standard of living not in the abstract, but rather as a condition that can advance child development. And last, Article 18 that defines parental duty to support their own children, upbringing and development. So conceptualizing the child-parent relationship in human rights term, defining parents' role primarily as to support their child development. So it's all about child development. This framework is vested in ensuring that children can develop. And that's the international framework, and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child makes similar commitment to the protection of child development, and it defines this objective as a right of the child in a similar way under Article 5. So if you compare the 2 documents, Article 5 of the African Charter and Article 6 of the UNCRC are very similar. And in addition to Article 5, other articles refer to the duty to protect specific domains of child development in a similar context as to the one that we find in the Convention, namely education in Article 11, the right of children with disabilities in Article 13, or the rights of working children in Article 15. Article 20 of the African Charter, so like Article 18 of the Convention, constructs the parent-child relationship in a similar way and suggests that parents or others who have caring responsibilities for children have, and I'm quoting, the primary responsibility for the upbringing and development of the child, end of quote. Thus again, cementing the idea that growing up is what childhood is all about. And Section B of Article 20 continues to suggest that parents should secure, based on their financial abilities, living conditions necessary for the child development. And the last article of the African Charter that I would like to mention is Article 21, which, similar to Article 19 of the UNCRC, asks to protect children from harmful social and cultural practices that affect the child welfare, dignity, normal growth, and development, a phrase that we don't find under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this long list suggests that the international framework very much resonates with the African values and the ways in which the expectations that children in African countries can expect duty bearers and the state to see their development being protected. But nonetheless, this long list tells us very little about the meaning and implications of why and how protection of child development should look like, and what are the implications of conceptualizing the care for child development as a matter of rights. And a broad, more fundamental question is why international child law sets the protection of child development as a matter of priority. And I think that answering the last question can give us some indications about the previous ones as to what it means to see child development being protected as a matter of human rights. So why does international child rights law and why the African Charter of the Rights and Welfare of the Child invest so much time and space in emphasizing the need to protect child development? And I think that the answer to this question is rooted in the ways in which the law conceptualized childhood, which is rooted very much in the human becoming approach to childhood. So the human becoming's approach to childhood is a theoretical concept has prevailed during the 20th century, mainly the Northern Hemisphere sociology of childhood. And this conception sees children as passive actors, lacking in agency, that they are weak and they are vulnerable and they are in need of protection. It positions children against adults. It describes childhood, according to SAJHR, as the absence of adult qualities, thus defining children as the negative others. The human becoming approach is essentially a deficit model, as it defines children based on what they are not. They are not adults, and they therefore don't have adults' assumed capabilities. The child, according to this thesis, is an unfinished product. The child is a human being in the making. Therefore, childhood, and this is what Prue and James argue, is a journey toward a destination. And as Nora O'Neill famously put it, children's only remedy is to grow up. But separating people based on their age also enables adults to assume control over children, and as Burman argues, to colonize them and eventually to civilize them. And it is in our context, it also enables them to control their development. The new sociology of childhood, which emerged during the 1970s, again, made in the Northern Hemisphere, suggested seeing children as human beings rather than as human becomings. And under the human beings approach, children are perceived as person rather than as projects. And the human being approach understands children on their own terms, instead of through the lens of comparing children to adults. This approach, which gained momentum during the 1980s in parallel to the drafting process of the Convention and of the African Charter, see children as active human beings who can and should participate in shaping their own lives and play an active role in their communities and in their families. And an essential component of this perception is respecting children's agency and their social and legal position as right holders. As Freeman notes, right and agency are interdependent and indivisible, and those who have human rights can exercise agency. They can make their own lives rather than having their lives made for them. And the capacity of children to make sense of the world around them does not have any age limit. As Alderson and her colleagues have shown in 2005, premature babies have the capacity to actively participate in their own life too, and they can express their preferences and needs. These young children do so by using body language, which is the only mode of communication which is available for them, suggesting, and also by vocal communication, which is crying. In a similar way, children or adults who have limited or no verbal skills can also communicate in non-verbal ways, for example, through drawing or acting. And this mode of communication requires an audience, as Landy describes in her model of participation. It requires an audience who is willing to listen. And for our purposes, the human being approach to childhood requires adults to be able and willing to listen to children talking about and acting and shaping their own development. And we'll come up to this point towards the end. And out of this model of children, development is something that children do, and it's not something that fundamentally defines them as part of the human becoming model. And the convention, going back to the law, embraces to some extent these two dichotomies models of childhood, but it nonetheless remains torn between protection and empowerment, between being and becoming. And it reflects for some example, and this tension is reflected for some example in a paternalistic and mostly common understanding of the best interest principle, and between different approaches that torn between empowering children by recognizing their right to participation or subjugating their agency to paternalistic approaches to Article 3 and the best interest principles. And these two rights, Article 3 and Article 6, have been recognized by the UN Committee on the Right of the Child, together with Article 2 and Article 12, the right to non-discrimination, which I'll discuss in a minute, and Article 12, the right to participation, as guiding principles of the Convention in General Comment number 5 from 2003. And we'll maybe have time to speak about the meaning of conceptualizing the right to development as a guiding principle later today in the Q&A session. But going back to the question about the meaning and implication of protecting child development as a right of the child, I would like to look at how the committee on the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have addressed this question, especially in the context of early childhood and discrimination, an ongoing challenge in many countries, including in South Africa, as was mentioned by Muriel in her opening speech. So the UN Committee working assumption, at least in its first 20 years of operation, it began scrutinizing state parties' report in 1993, was based on the conception of children as human becomings. The committee has referred to child development countless times in the context of the 5 specific articles that I mentioned at the beginning, but also with respect to almost every other human rights the convention mentions. All articles but one, Article 12, and I'll come back to this point later. And when you read the committee's body of work, you can conclude, or this is how I conclude, that it seems that the committee subjugates many of the convention rights to the promotion of full or optimum development for children. But nonetheless, it doesn't say much about the meaning of this objective, nor about the distinct meaning of caring for child development as a matter, as an abstract term, or as providing for children development as a matter of a right for the child. Nonetheless, in the last 10 years or so, mainly from 2013 onwards, we see a slow shift in the committee's approach, both in the concluding observation and in its general comments, where the committee began to think about children as human beings and to show more respect for their agency and to acknowledge that the right to development should be addressed independently of other rights and separately from the overall objective of promoting child development under the convention. And as I said, I would like to focus and to do a deep dive into the relationship that the committee has established between the right to non-discrimination and child development, and the question of early childhood development and the convention rights, 2 questions that the special issue focuses on too. The text of Article 2 doesn't say anything about child development. When you read the drafting history of the convention, you don't find any discussion about non-discrimination in child development or the right to development either. These 2 are not being mentioned together. Nonetheless, the relationship is almost self-explanatory, especially when it comes to access to social services, health and education, and the impact that discrimination can have on child development in this space. And indeed, such a conclusion was drawn by the committee in 2000, when it explicitly started to state that the violation of the right to non-discrimination undermines child development and the right to development as well. The committee further suggested that discrimination leads to harassment and to racial hatred and xenophobia that can result in denying children access to public services, especially housing, health services and education. And in time of COVID, we saw how that plays out as well. And this, in turn, deprives children of the necessary support for their physical, mental, and moral development, the committee says, as well as their personal talent. On other occasions, the committee suggested that discrimination has a general negative effect on child development and that it constitutes a violation of the child's rights to survival and development under Article 6.2. And the committee said that combating and eliminating discrimination is therefore essentially ensuring the realization of the right to development. And over the years, particular attention was given to vulnerable groups of children who are often subject to social practices or political policies of discrimination. And we speak about girls, children of ethnic minorities, Aboriginal, Indigenous children, children born out of wedlock, children from lower income groups, rural children, child refugees, working children, displaced children, children in street situations, child victims of sexual exploitation, children in the context of migration, and stateless children. And in its concluding observation about South Africa from 2016, the last one that we have, the committee was concerned with, I'm quoting, the discrimination faced by girls, children living with HIV/AIDS, children with disabilities, Indigenous children, stateless children, migrant, asylum-seeking and refugee children, children in street situations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex children, and children with albinism in accessing public services and child protection services, and at the highest exposure to violence, abuse, and harassment, end of quote. The committee was also concerned with, again, I'm quoting, the serious divide in access to basic services and inadequate standard of living in the country on the basis of race, geography, and economic status, with a disproportionate disadvantage for children living in rural areas and in urban informal settlements. End of quote. And many of the papers in the special issue address these structural barriers to promotion or to the promotion of early childhood development too. In the list of issues published in March this year, following the submission of the South African government periodic implementation report, the committee has asked the government to provide more information about, and I'm quoting, policy commitment on prohibition of discrimination against children on all grounds in line with the convention, including those contained in the National Action Plan to Combat Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances, the White Paper on Inclusive Education, the White Paper on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the National Integrated Early Childhood Development Policy. End of quote. And while we wait for the government to respond to this and to the constructive dialogue session in Geneva, we have a special issue, which is a great source to look at and analyze some of these policies and papers from a human rights perspective. And I was lucky to be able to read some of the drafts, and the papers do it brilliantly. And over the years, the committee has dedicated special attention to discrimination against three groups of children, which I mentioned already: girls, children with disabilities, and indigenous children. And with respect to gender-based discrimination, the committee highlights the younger marriage age for girls compared to boys as a practice that has a negative impact on the health, education, and social development of girls, and to suggest also arguing that pregnancy of young girls in fact is a risk factor for their development in the domestic sector. As to children with disabilities, the committee identifies some specific practices, including mistreatment and inadequate diagnostic systems, as well as discrimination that results in the lack of or insufficient access to health services, schools, education programs, and other facilities and programs that meet these children's needs, as having negative effect on their development in general and on their cultural development in particular. Sorry. In general comment number 9, the committee emphasized that social discrimination and stigmatization lead to the marginalization and exclusion of children with disabilities, which may threaten, and I'm quoting, their survival and development if it goes as far as physical or mental violence, end of quote. The committee further adds that the spiritual, emotional, and cultural development and well-being of children with disabilities are very often overlooked, and therefore suggests that some countries will establish programs and activities designed for the child's cultural development and spiritual well-being. However, only towards the end of this general comment, does the committee mention the right to development explicitly, stating that discrimination against children with disabilities not only poses a risk to their development, but can also result in the violation of numerous rights, including the right to development. As to the objective of child development, the committee makes a connection between the care for the development of children with disabilities and the ability of these children to maximize their potential, as well as their inclusion in society and to their enjoyment of full and decent life and participation in society. The third group of children, which is getting a lot of attention in the context of non-discrimination discussion, is indigenous children. In general comment number 11, dedicated this group of children, provides a comprehensive discussion about the rights of these children. At the outset, general comment 11 makes the same remarks concerning discrimination and its impact on child development that have previously been made with respect to other marginalized groups of children. But the novelty of this general comment is the explicit references to the right to development that it makes. For example, the committee expressed its concern that due to the particular vulnerability of indigenous children and the high level of poverty among them, discrimination could impact not only their survival and development, but also their right to an adequate standard of living. Similar recommendations are repeated in concluding observations about countries with substantial indigenous population and indigenous children, such as Canada, New Zealand, and in Australia. It therefore seems that protection of the right to non-discrimination will enable children to have greater access to public goods and services, and that in turn will promote their development and, more importantly, the right to development too. As such, the relationship between discrimination, racism, and child development is clear, and the committee is essentially saying that in protecting the right to non-discrimination, or that protecting, the right to non-discrimination is a precondition for realizing child development and the right to development. But it's still not clear from everything that is said what is the separate meaning of Article 6. The second issue that I would like to discuss is early child development in the context of children's rights, and again, look at what the committee has to say about this issue. The committee considers early childhood to be a critical moment for, I'm quoting, for realizing children's rights, end of quote, in general, and to the promotion of child development in particular. It characterizes the period as a period of rapid changes, and essentially it suggests that the state of development is definitive of baby's existence. In general comment number 7, dedicated to the rights of the child in early childhood, the committee says, and I'm quoting, young children experience the most rapid period of growth and change during the human lifespan in terms of their maturing bodies and nervous system, increasing mobility, communication skills, and intellectual capacities, and rapid shifts in their interests and abilities, end of quote. Embracing John Bowlby's attachment theory, the committee adds that, and I'm quoting, the children form strong emotional attachment to their parents or other caregivers from whom they seek and requires nutrients, care, guidance, and protection in ways that are respectful of their individual and growing capacities, end of quote. The care for children's development in the early years seems to serve a dual purpose then. Not only that it has a positive impact on children's current well-being, but even more crucially, it also has a positive impact on children's future prospects, including preventing various difficulties in the later stages of their life. The committee therefore concludes that the early years of the children's life are, and I'm quoting, the foundation for their physical and mental health, emotional security, cultural and personal identity, and developing competencies, end of quote. And perhaps even more importantly is the committee assertion that, and again I'm quoting and apologize for these long quotes, that young children experiences of growth and development vary according to their individual nature, as well as their gender, living condition, family organization, care arrangements, and education systems, end of quote. And this is a rare acknowledgement that children are not a homogeneous group of human beings, and that the intersection of identities and living conditions, cultural, care arrangement, and education shapes their experience of development and affects their life in the present and in the future. General comment 7 also offers a rare explanation about the relationship between child development, the right to development, and other rights of children. And again, I'm quoting, the committee says ensuring survival and physical health are priorities, but state parties are reminded that Article 6 encompasses all aspects of development. The committee reminds third parties and other concerns that the right to survival and development can only be implemented in a holistic manner through the enforcement of all the other provisions of the convention, including right to health, adequate nutrition, social security, and adequate standard of living, a healthy and safe environment, education, and play, as well as through respect for the responsibilities of parents and the provision of assistance and quality services, end of quote. This is a relatively comprehensive perspective about the relationship between the convention rights and the right to development. Specifically, the committee states that protecting other rights of the child, such as the right to health or the right to education, is a prerequisite to the promotion of the right to development. And this is similar to what we saw in the committee discussion about the right to non-discrimination in Article 2. But once again, we are told very little about the distinct meaning of the right to development, or about the differences between protecting the right to development in and of itself and protecting other rights of the child that can lead to the protection of the right to development as well, or about the reasons not to consider the realization of all of these rights as a sufficient protection of child development, and thus making Article 6 redundant. And this statement, nonetheless, also mixes child development and child survival and child well-being together with the child futures, despite the analytical and theoretical differences between these four concepts, and the fact that the convention, for example, doesn't speak about child well-being at all. It mentions development, it mentions survival, and it mentions best interest. And when discussing early childhood development in a concluding observation, and unlike the approach that the committee has taken in general comment number 7, the committee usually overlooks the right to development and instead make some general statement about the significance of promoting early childhood development programs, especially among low-income households. One area of early childhood development which gains an increasing attention over the years is preschool education and the positive impact it has on the promotion of child development, and thus to some extent expanding on what the convention is saying, as the convention Article 28 only makes compulsory primary education compulsory and free. And the curriculum and the special issue have some papers that make similar arguments about the relationship between education and development. And they are providing also some analysis of the challenges with the formation and implementation of South Africa's National Early Education Program, challenges that are past and very much present. The country is still facing, and it's interesting to see how a rights-based approach to these policies can shape and the direction of the development of this and the implementation of these policies. And while the committee, going back to the committee, primarily uses a needs-based discourse in its recommendation, I think that most of this recommendation can and should be articulated in human rights terms. This is where the child's right to health, the right to social security, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to education, the right to play and leisure, and the right to non-discrimination become relevant. But once again, the committee takes the position that promoting these rights will inevitably promote child early development too. But the question still remains, what the relevancy of and the relationship with the right to development in this space? It remains insufficiently addressed. In a similar vein, over the years, the committee has connected almost each and every right of the convention to child development, as I mentioned at the beginning, from education to healthcare to the right to an identity and the identification documents, Articles 7 and 8 and 9, to the rights of refugee children and asylum-seeking children, to the positionality of children in street situation, whose their development was front and center in General Comment 21 from 2017 that was dedicated to these children. But when you read and you try to analyze all of the committee's concluding observation and general comments from 1993, it seems that the committee sees the protection of child development and the right to development in one of two ways. Either protecting one right of the child, for example, the right to non-discrimination, which was mentioned before, is a precondition to protect child development too. Or, for example, in the case of the right to education, the committee seems to suggest that protecting one right of the child would result simultaneously in promoting child development. If a child attends schools and receives quality education, that will be protected under Article 28 and 29 of the Convention, but it will also fulfill the requirements of Article 6.2 rights. But yet again, and I'm hammering on this point, this doesn't provide a concrete nor separate interpretation of the right of development. In that sense, 32 years after the adoption of the convention coming into force, it allows state parties to develop their own understanding of it, or in practice, enable state parties and other duty bearers to ignore their distinct duty to protect and promote the child rights to development, and give advocates very little substance to work with, which is rather ironic given the significance of child development under the convention and the committee's own body of work. And with the time that remains, I would like to try and provide a framework that can be used when we think about Article 6 and the right to development in slightly more concrete terms, something that might hopefully will enable us and all of us in this room to develop a more concrete and holistic understanding of the right to development. And this framework is divided into a conceptual argument and to an empirical component. The empirical component sits with the science of child development, which is a heterogeneous body of knowledge which sits outside of the convention and frankly outside law. As an international treaty, the convention by design should not include a detailed definition of what child development stands for, as it represents a dynamic, rich, diverse, context-sensitive concept which is not free from biases. The convention is a legal document and child development is beyond the law. Child development is not a legal concept. We don't teach child development in law schools, and speaking as lawyers, we have to reach out to other disciplines and learn from them about the meaning of child development. It's beyond our reach. If we can compare, to illuminate this point, we can compare child development to the right of freedom of speech. Speech, like development, is a dynamic concept, but we know as lawyers how to deal with it. Speech used to mean standing at the street corner and protesting against the government. And then it evolved to be written speech, which led to questions, for example, of censorship and balancing freedom of speech against other people's safety. If you think about the classic example of John Stuart Mill about one freedom to shout fire in a crowded theater, or questions about freedom of speech and other people's reputation. Today's speech can also be a tweet or choosing one's avatar in an online game. And then there is a need to balance this freedom and this mode of expression with competing interests and rights. But it's something that we as lawyers and law, by and large, laws and judges and policymakers can adapt and change and interpret Bill of Rights and constitutional rights that protect freedom of speech to this evolving and changing definition of what speech is and how speech is exercised. But this is not the case when it comes to child development. Lawyers don't have a disciplinary specific knowledge about it. Other disciplines, on the other hand, like psychology or education or social work or pediatric or psychiatry, are better equipped to understand, study, and analyze child development. But this body of knowledge are not homogenic. There is no singular understanding of what child development means in development psychology, for example. And certainly there is not an understanding of what good, normal, or healthy development means, or the consequences of disruption to an ideal theoretical process of growth. If we take the classic example of Freud's theory of sexual development, his claim was that children should move from one developmental stage to the other, and disturbance to each stage, a delayed transition or other interruptions will result in, for example, difficulties forming intimate relationship in adulthood. But this process focuses on the process of healthy process of growth, resonating with the 1924 Declaration on the Rights of the Child as a means to ensure the creation of a normal adult. In pediatric, the story is similar. Medical doctors can measure the child's height or weight, and they can tell us where the child sits when the child needs to start crawling or walking or talking. And medicine, in that sense, situates a standardized child on a chart, and in turn, the chart tells us a very particular story of development and whether the child develops normally or not. And if the child is out of curve, then there is a medical intervention which is needed. And this is especially true in the early development setting, where every week and every month of the child life is designated with specific target and specific developmental targets that the child should meet. We have an immunization schedule that must be followed to protect the child's health. And this sterile schedule usually provides a specific time frame for each vaccine, leaving a small window for maneuver. And if you miss the perfect moment, then you might put your child's health and even the child's life at risk. This benchmark measures the child against an imaginary child without considering individual child state of being, intersectionality of identities, or the circumstances of the child's family. It once again measures the child and compares the child to this abstract understanding of childhood as defined by adults. And not only that these bodies of knowledge are not homogeneous or universal, and there are different childhoods everywhere, if you think about children in more concrete terms, but they are also not free from biases, especially racial and gender biases. And there are also biases against children raised in poverty or against children with physical, mental, or cognitive disabilities. And as Nancy Dowd showed in the context of policies targeting Black children in the United States, the so-called scientific matrices are really irrelevant to the life of many children, not only because, and that's from her, the rats in the lab where these scientific models were developed were also white. So where does it leave us? How can we think about the right to development in a way that will make sense to children and that will be sufficiently concrete to duty bearers? So our duty as lawyers and our duty as those who are in charge of interpreting and executing the convention is to reach out to other disciplines. But as Emily Bass rightly said, law should remain in a driving seat. We should embrace this knowledge, acknowledging its limitation and its biases, and then see what the law actually tries to do. And this leads me to the conceptual questions. Let's go to the heart of the image of the child under international child rights law and the meaning of childhood. Based on the human becoming model of deficiency, the child is defined against what she is not, and therefore the essence of her childhood is about becoming one, becoming an adult. Against this concept of childhood and this view of the child, the understanding of the right to development is essentially the right to grow up. But if we think about children and childhood in a different way, and if we respect the human dignity and agency for what it is, and not for only what it can be, then the right to development can mean something differently. And more specifically, I suggest considering 3 dimensions that can develop a concrete understanding of this right. First, we should abandon this this binary distinction between human being and human becoming, and stop seeing children as either future adults or to focus on their presence while ignoring their future. Instead, in building of the work of Janusz Korczak here, we can think about childhood in a hybrid way. A hybrid childhood that goes beyond these two somewhat rigid frameworks of future and present. A hybrid framework that sees children for who they are at the present and for what they can and might become in the future, and how these two elements intertwine and interrelated rather than as two separate elements. And in a similar fashion, this is the second dimension, we should distinguish between the developmental process and the outcome of the process. The right to development under general international law is formulated, for example, in the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development and the 1993 Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and the literature around it distinguishes between the process of development and the outcome of it. The context and objects of development under general international law is different. There, the right to development focuses on collectives, on people and nations, seeing economic development, mainly economic development, as an objective in and of itself, and is a key to poverty reduction policies and human prosperity. The Convention on the Rights of the Child and its version of the right to development focuses on children as individuals and their personal development. But nonetheless, the analytical distinction between process and outcome is important, and it can be useful in the context of children's rights too, as it enables us to think beyond, to think about ways to differentiate between these two elements of human growth. In this way, we can differentiate between what the child will become and the process of getting the child there. And in a similar fashion, to think about the right to development as a right that is relevant to both the process of growth as well as to its objective, the end result of this process. But when we think about the present time and the future, we should do it from the perspective of children's own perception of time and temporality, which might be different than adults' perception. The future, the abstract future for a child and the end result of the development process is not necessarily found in the age of 18 or adulthood. The end process can be the end of the school year, or moving from primary school to high school, or finishing an internship at the end of the agricultural season. Processes of development and growth come to fulfillment during the child's legal childhood, and not only when legal childhood ends, and this should be taken into account as well. And this leads me to the third and last dimension, which is the duty to respect children's agency and enabling them to participate in the process of defining and protecting their own developmental processes and trajectory. For Amartya Sen, development is freedom. And this freedom can only be achieved by respecting the dignity and agency of those who are at the margin of society, enabling them to define and pursue their own capabilities, and by doing that to achieve freedom. This logic and processes could include children too. Article 12 of the Convention respects the right to participation of all children, irrespectively of their age. As mentioned before, the UN Committee did not establish any meaningful relationship between the right to participation and the right of development. This silence is telling, reinforcing the paternalistic approach to children, their childhood, their development, and their rights. Participation, nonetheless, must be a fundamental principle in the process of realizing the right to development of children. And this is probably the biggest challenge in the journey of realizing Article 6 in practice. The challenge is to think about children as agents of their own development. When we think about childhood in a hybrid way, when we analytically distinguishing between the process of growth and the outcome of this process, and we respect children's agency and human dignity for what they are, in their current and future potential state of development. And when we enable them to participate in their own development, we can work to realize the right to development of children as the right to fulfill their human potential to the maximum in the present, during their childhood, and through their entire lifespan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Noam. That was exceptionally rich. You covered a lot of ground there, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. Before I go to the questions, if I may abuse my role as chair, I thought you provided such a sweeping and wonderfully instructive overview of how the right to development has been in the background and has slowly become more foregrounded, but perhaps not as much as it should be, with some significant areas for further development of the right to development. One area that you touched on was the role of the right to development as a guiding principle. And I'm wondering if you'd be able to expand on that a little bit more. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is, how do we use the right to development as a guiding principle without falling into some of the difficulties or challenges we've seen with the best interest of the child, where it becomes a concept that's everything and maybe nothing at the same time?
Thank you, Nuria. That's the main and the most difficult question, I think. Because one of the risks is that if everything supports child development and realization of all rights of the child leads to support of child development, then why do we need Article 6 to begin with? And in a similar vein, why do we need to define, or what is the added value of defining Article 6 and the right to development as a guiding principle of the convention, and how we evade the risks that we see with respect to Article 3. So I think there are a number of things that can be said about it. It's not very clear why the committee defined Article 6 as one of the guiding principles of the convention. So in that sense, this definition was introduced in 2003. General comment number 5 doesn't say much as to why or what the implications of this definition are, and it's led to some ambiguity around it, and in practice to ignoring this definition altogether. It's all very easy to speak about 2, 3, and 12 in that context, about non-discrimination as a guiding principle. Obviously, every policy or law or action should be non-discriminatory. The same goes about participation. The realization of all rights of the child should be done in participatory matter, and that's the added value of defining Article 12 as a guiding principle. It's almost self-explanatory why the best interest principle is defined as a guiding principle, but it still leaves us with an ambiguity and a lot of room for interpretation and abuse as to the meaning of the best interest principle. So in general comment 14, the committee was trying to put some more, to provide some more substance, dividing the best interest principle into these 3 subcategories: as a substantive right, as a rule of interpretation, and as a rule of procedure. And I think that this analytical distinction can be modified and then used when we think about Article 6 as a guiding principle. Laura Lundy and Carl Hansen are not convinced, for example, that Article 6 should be a guiding principle to begin with. So in a paper that they published 2 years ago, they suggest that Article 6 should not be on this list, and instead Article 5 and the evolving capacities principle should be a guiding principle of the convention. They believe that it has much more traction in the drafting history of the convention. And in substance, I mean, subjugating the realization of the child rights to the evolving capacities is a cross-cutting principle, and the corresponding duty that parents have to support their children makes it much more concrete and relevant to every decision you make about the child. But I think that 5 and 6 are not mutually exclusive. And I think maybe now I'll get some more to the point of your question. In a similar vein to the need to ensure that we act with respect to individual children or to children as a collective in a non-discriminatory way, and that we enable children to participate in decision-making processes, in decisions that concerns their life. And when we need to ensure that their best interest is a primary consideration under the convention, or the primary consideration under Article Charter, the utility of these articles as guiding principles is almost self-explanatory. And I think the same goes for Article 6, not least because we saw how embedded the need to protect child development in the convention is. So we have specific domains where the convention explicitly refers to child development and refers to some specific domains of child development: spiritual development, mental development. But developmental needs are supported beyond those specific events, education or health for children with disabilities. Those are cross-cutting principles, and any decision concerning children should fulfill or should be measured against its potential impact on children's development as a matter of right. So children should participate in the decision whether how this early childhood education framework should look like, should consider their educational needs, should be formulated in a participatory way, The decision makers should consider different alternatives and how they will affect and impact children's best interest. But in a similar vein, this draft proposal or any policy evaluation or execution should be evaluated and thought of through the prism of child development and the potential impact it can have of children's development. In a rights-based approach manner, children should be given the opportunity to participate and to define their own development. This dual dimension should be taken into account, how child development will be affected in the present time as part of the process of development, but also what it might yield to. What is the ending process here? And education is imperative, and it encapsulates these two definitions. And I will end with that. Teachers and those who work with children know that you work with children at the present time. Children enjoy and laugh and are being challenged or being frustrated. Education happens here and now, but it also has long-term effects, hopefully positive ones. And this is what we should think about when we think about educational policies from a child rights perspective, emphasizing the right to development as a guiding principle.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We're going to open up for broad Q&A now. I'm hoping that people will be able to raise their hands. So please feel free to come in and ask any questions. Tim. And I'm going to stop recording at this point.
Oh, what a shame. I was hoping